I was chatting yesterday with my comrade Wasim and the other Egyptian comrades, and one remark we had is that after attending all of those meetings yesterday, we were surprised that actually no one was recording or using their mobile phones to record this lecture. I mean, if this was happening in Egypt, probably you would find good number of people, I won't say like half the audience, but good number of people who would be taking videos of what's going on. And at least there will be one person who will be live streaming the event. I mean, this is not something organizational, this is something spontaneous that everybody does, you know, I mean, more or less in Egypt. And we don't really see it that much here in Britain. And when we even looked at the hashtag, you know, I mean, Marx 2012, which is for this conference, we more or less like found out that maybe 3 or 4 people only like tweeted about like the lectures that we've been attending, which is also, I mean, completely different from what goes on back home. I think Egypt provides a fantastic case for what Trotsky describes as the combined and uneven development. A nation of 90 million people, that's like the Egyptian, you know, I mean, population. A nation of 90 million people. 40% of which are under the poverty line, yet the mobile phone saturation is 112%, according to the government stats. Meaning that more than 76 million Egyptians have mobile phones, and we have more or less like 92.7 million SIM cards in Egypt. I mean, the combined and uneven development, you see it in our daily lives. I mean, anybody of you who might have visited Cairo, I mean, you would notice this immediately. You will find in the same street the Mercedes beside the donkey cart. You'll find, you know, I mean, the posh neighborhood, you know, beside it you'll find the slum. You will enter the slum, but you will find inside the slum like satellite dishes, you know, and cables and, you know, internet wirings and all of these things. And that's a feature of the society we're living in. I'm going to speak like as briefly as possible about the Egyptian experience over the past decade, and then I'm going to hand over the mic to my comrade here. Internet activism more or less like started around the year 2000 in Egypt. From 1992 onwards, the Egyptian regime had signed a neoliberal agreement with the IMF and the World Bank under the name ERSAT, the Economic Reform and Structural Adjustment Program. And more or less it happened within the same year as our war on terror started. War on terror and neoliberalism always go hand in hand in most countries. Part or cornerstone of this neoliberal program was to create an IT hub in Egypt that would compete with India and other places in the world when it comes to outsourcing IT jobs. So the ironic thing that happened is that you had a government or a regime that's like committed to the destruction of the working class, to the destruction of any sort of social welfare, but at the same time, in order to do this, they were also creating more or less this strong infrastructure of telecommunication in Egypt. By the year 2000, and that's when the Palestinian Intifada broke out, the second Palestinian Intifada, the government statistics puts the government stats put the number of those in Egypt who had access to the internet at roughly 400,000 people, only 400,000. The last report that came out by the Ministry of Telecommunication in May put the number of Egyptians who have access to the internet at 30 million. So in one decade, from less than 500,000, we've reached 30 million people. And again, I mean, as I told you, in terms of mobile networks or mobile phone infiltration or saturation, it's basically booming everywhere. Which means that the biggest social network, more or less, that we have in Egypt is Bluetooth, not the internet. There is so much like myth, and there is so much like painting of a rosy picture about like social media and activism in Egypt. But most of those who are trying to theorize about it or report about it forget the fact that most of the Egyptian bloggers or most of those who are into social media, they have one foot in the cyberspace and the other foot is on the ground. And the two go hand in hand, more or less. The start of the Egyptian blogosphere, as we call it, started by the late, like December 2004, and we put the number of Egyptian blogs at the time at only like 30 Egyptian blogs, more or less. The politicization of the blogosphere started in 2005, following what's called Black Wednesday. This was the day that the government organized sexual assaults against women reporters and women activists in broad daylight in front of everybody, in a day where we were protesting the constitutional amendments that Mubarak was putting forward. There were few bloggers present in that protest. They went back home. Of course, no mainstream media reported on what was going on. And they were the only ones who took like, pictures, videos, blah, 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 and they started uploading them online. And they made a call for citizen journalists to join in. The blogosphere has been booming since then. From only 30 blogs in December 2004, they reached roughly in 2006 like 1,500. And then a government report came out in 2008, putting the number of Egyptian blogs at 282,000 blogs that we had in Egypt. Now it's impossible, to map it, because it's not just blogs. You have different platforms. There are people using Facebook, there are people using Twitter, there are people using the different platforms of the blogs. The other turning point that I should stop at is 2008, the Mahalla uprising, which it was an uprising by the urban poor and the workers in that Nile Delta town, which includes the textile mill. It's like the third largest in the world and the largest in the Middle East, called Ghazl al-Mahalla. And prior to the 6th of April 2008, there were wide calls for a general strike, mainly on Facebook, by the political activists. And when the uprising happened, most of the media, in addition to especially the Western media, they were obsessed with this like Facebook activism. And they gave credit, to the uprising to that Facebook group, the 6th of April. But it's a mistake. What happened in 2008 is that the workers on the ground who do not actually have access to the internet, most of them at the time at least, they had issued a warning that they were striking 2 months before. And they went and they met the several, political leaders of the several movements and to call for solidarity. So some political activists decided to call for a general strike, on that day. And the call was picked up very quickly, in the social media sphere. But the thing is, when you look at it, the general strike actually failed. There is no general strike that happened on that day. As revolutionary socialists in Egypt at the time, our position was that we are not endorsing the general strike call. Why? Because you cannot organize general strikes via Facebook. And that we were only mobilizing on the ground in the places where we had support or we had presence on the ground. And that includes, of course, Ghazl al-Mahalla, whose strike leadership was largely revolutionary socialists, in other textile mills that are related to Ghazl al-Mahalla, the universities that we had presence at the time. So if you look at it, at the end of the day, those who actually moved on the ground in 2008 were the locations that the political activist community had presence on. It's not like, people read it on Facebook, oh, there is general strike tomorrow, so, let's do it. But the whole narrative became that the uprising was caused by this Facebook page. And that same narrative also continued up until, more or less, today. After all, the Egyptian revolution was described as a Facebook revolution, which of course negates the truth, and more or less, it wipes out the idea that there were 10 years of struggle in the run-up to January 25th, 2011, and January 25th, 2011 was more or less like the climax, or you reached the peak. That's when everything exploded. And if revolutions were simply organized by a Facebook event that you can click, I'm attending, then why didn't all the general strikes, the calls for general strikes, before 2011, that were uttered on Facebook or were circulated on Facebook, why did they fail? They didn't happen. Every 2 months, some political activist community would get on Facebook and call for a general strike. And of course, this didn't happen. January 25th was different. Why? No one can predict when revolutions, happen, but we had reached more or less the crunch stage where things could not continue. anymore as they are. The power of social media in Egypt is largely related to its unofficial marriage to the mainstream media. That's what also some people do not notice. Meaning, my blog, which had been described as, and I'm proud of that, as one of the most influential blogs, blah, 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 how many people read my blog? At the end of the day, when I look at the stats, the highest day I ever got hits at it were 11,000 readers, that's all. 11,000 readers. My Twitter account, for example, I have like 90,000 people, on it. Out of 90 million Egyptians, that's really nothing. But the power of social media among the activist community had come from the fact that many journalists, whether in Egypt or abroad, are monitoring, social media. Journalists are extremely lazy. Instead of their old methods of using the telephone. So what happened today? Okay, so this, blah, blah, blah. Now they are sitting in front of their laptops, monitoring what's happening, and then, okay, so this happened, blah, 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 this happened, blah, 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 So if I write a tweet, for example, about some information, or I put some information on my blog, I'm assured 200% that it will get into Reuters. And if it gets into Reuters, this means millions of people around the world will know about it. Or Al Jazeera, will be monitoring it. So it would reach at least 100 million people. Or the BBC is monitoring it. So it would reach also millions of other people. This was really the power of social media, more or less, until recently. Because there were few changes that we can discuss later, maybe. During the uprising itself, during the 18 days, the telecommunications were disrupted. Mubarak shut down completely all sorts of telecommunications on the Friday of Anger. And then the service was disrupted several times all throughout the 18 days. But still the revolution continued. It was not really dependent on the internet at the time. But how did we mobilize for those 1 million men and women marches and those mass protests in Tahrir when telecommunications were shut down, in addition, of course, to the general state of disarray, among all the organizations, including us, during the uprising? It was simple. If we are in Tahrir and the organizers have sat down and discussed and agreed that tomorrow we're going to have a 1 million man protest, then one of us would draft a statement and then go to Al Jazeera and tell them, we are having tomorrow 1 million man protest. So Al Jazeera would go in, tomorrow the activist community are having 1 million man protests. So all our comrades in all the other provinces would actually know that we're holding, a protest tomorrow, in addition to the ordinary Egyptians who want to join, and that's how they joined. So it was more or less an unofficial marriage between the two. But it also means that more or less you're also at the mercy of those mainstream media organizations, more or less. Al Jazeera is more or less anti-Mubarak because of the politics between Qatar and Egypt, so they were more than happy, to spread our messages. But others, were not. And Al Jazeera's position itself keeps on changing. What if the Emir of Qatar meets now Field Marshal Tantawi, they agree on something, no reports whatsoever about Egypt, will come out on Al Jazeera. And I want to finalize maybe with this point, our dependence on the mainstream media is actually shrinking by the time. Why? Because of the boom in the social media and in the number of people who have access to the internet. The latest government stats puts 38% of the Egyptian families, they have access now to the internet from their homes. I know tons of comrades who actually joined the movement via Twitter. They were following, our news, via our Twitter, and they were how can we, reach those guys? When the mainstream media doesn't want to report on anything that we're doing, we actually now have our social network that has millions of Egyptians now on it. It's not as tiny as it used to be. And we can use it as some sort of a parallel media operation for that. There were numerous occasions where strikes and protests were organized, basically by the polls, online. But they materialized because there were activists on the ground who can implement this. I can tell you also about numerous occasions where calls for general strikes or mass protests happened on the internet, but nothing materialized on the ground. Because you would call for a protest, but which organization will go to with the banners and they will be ready and they will tell people, go here, go there, that's how we do it, blah, blah, blah. And in occasions it completely failed. But the last point I want to talk about, comrades, is that I think the socialist movement needs to open a real discussion about the use of social media. As much as I'm really honored by what I hear from some comrades about how the Egyptian revolutionary socialists are using social media and they are way far ahead compared to other groups in the tendency, I have to admit that for a very long time, our use of social media was left to our individual initiatives. Not like, some overall organizational strategy that can push forward, in that direction. And we need also to think about something else in this world we're in, where things keep changing by the minute. What sort of organizer do we need at the moment? The paper is irreplaceable. We will continue to sell our papers in the streets. We will continue to engage in whatever protests we have, with our newspapers. You gotta have this. But at the same time, if a coup happens today, in Egypt, for example, I'm not gonna wait till next week in order for the socialists, our newspaper, to come out so as to know, what sort of position are we taking regarding this. And I would assume also that this is also the situation here in Britain. You have not reached the revolutionary situation yet, and I do believe that you will reach it, one day. There is nothing special about Britain. But even in the day or the age we're living in, and there are political developments happening, around the minute. You're not going to wait for socialist worker to come out next week to tell you what to do. Today. You need something that's fast, that's quick, but at the same time that can reach, your audience internally and outside. And I think we need to start rethinking about what sort of organizer we need at the moment and explore the untapped potentials that the cyberspace is providing us, which again does not replace our actions on the ground. Thank you.
I think it's really good how we started off the meeting, because Hossam really talks about the practice of social media inside of the Egyptian revolution and the social movement that, prior to the Egyptian revolution that took place. And what I want to do in the second part of the meeting really is try to develop a theoretization of how we can understand social media, of how we can understand the dialectic between revolution and technology, as well as the nature of the internet, and effectively tap into some of the questions that Hossam raises at the very end that relate to agitation and propaganda. Why did the general strike on February 11th, and why did the agitation not bear fruit? Well, what kind of propaganda do we exactly need? And I think it's important, because I think if we look around the mainstream media, what we see, Twitter is, Twitter caused the Arab Spring. I simply reject such a claim on a fundamental basis. But however, I think it doesn't mean that we need to reject Twitter as a whole. What I want to argue in the meeting in particular is that we can use social media, we can use the internet and the cyberspace to build revolutionary organizations. And to complement our work that Hossam outlined alongside our propaganda and our papers. Now, what I want to really talk about is I will refer to a number of Marxist thinkers throughout the next 20 minutes. And once Tony Cliff said we can look further because we stand on the shoulders of giants. And I think that's really the crux of the meeting today, because we want to look further than just falling into the kind of dichotomy that online networks in some way can replace real offline networks and revolutionary organization. That's just ludicrous. We also want to reject the kind of dichotomy that effectively has come about, that came up in the students' movement in 2010, that you didn't need any kind of organizations whatsoever, and that all you had to do is go onto Twitter, tweet a bit, have it trending, and everyone would come into the streets. But however, there is a relationship between technology and revolution that I want to explore, and namely, it starts in 1848. The message of the 1848 revolution took only 6 days to reach from Paris to Milan. In 1789, the message of the storming of the Bastille had taken exactly 13 days reach Milan. And those changes that happen in the what Marx calls the base ultimately have to reflect also in how we as revolutionary socialists and socialists adapt to the objective circumstances. And much like the 19th century, in which there was massive industrialization, today the Arab world is, as Hossam has outlined, goes hand in hand as that as well. Today we fast forward 2011 and effectively we're watching the Egyptian revolution unfold in live stream. We see how Simon Assaf posts videos that no one would otherwise find about the Syrian revolution. We see how Alex Kalinikos gives an analysis of the Eurozone in 200 words on Facebook. But what does that ultimately mean? Ultimately, the reason why 1848 and even the Egyptian 2011 is so fundamental isn't because the fact that suddenly we have these technologies at our disposal. No, 1848 was crucial in the sense that for the first time communists and socialists gained influence and changed the balance of forces inside of those revolutions. And so today we need to understand in how far technologies can facilitate that challenge of forces. So we can't fall into either the kind of cyber utopianism that you see on the one hand, which says, well, the internet will be the basis of human liberation for all, and all we have to do is use the internet, etc., that effectively can change everything. And at the same time, we can't fall into the cyber dystopianism as people like Mozorov and others have painted a very bleak picture of the world. Because as Marxists, as dialectical materialists, we understand the role of technology in a different way. Marx was very clear that innovation and technology were not the engines of history, but effectively the emancipation of the working class as the act of the working class itself was the engine of history. And what he understood was that he wasn't scared of new technology. He wasn't scared, and he grasped their potentialities. The kind of productive forces that capitalism unleashes are barbaric, and at the same time they have immense potential to facilitate and to even lay the basis for human liberation and socialism. And what Frederick Jameson writes in his book Postmodernism or the Late Logic of Capitalism is the following. In a well-known passage, Marx powerfully urges us to do the impossible, namely to think this development, the historical development of capitalism, positively and negatively all at once. We are somehow to lift our minds to a point at which it is possible to understand that capitalism is at one and the same time the best thing that has ever happened to the human race and the worst. And that's really the dialectic that we need to understand today when we're talking about social media and capitalism. Because at the same time, while it has empowered Egyptian revolutionaries, it has empowered the youth in Bahrain, it has empowered students who stormed Millbank, at the same time it alienates. It actually disempowers at the same time. And what Walter Benjamin wrote was that the scars of the suffering that was part and parcel of it also kind of have the promise of human liberation in its way. So how did the Bolsheviks try to grapple with new technological innovations? Effectively, at the time after the Civil War, the Russian film market was flooded with American Hollywood movies, and Lenin had a task at hand. How was he going to stop American movies from flooding in? Similar to the situation that we have the dominance of Google, we have the dominance of Facebook, we have the dominance of all these different eBay and whatever they're called. And effectively, how did he try to grapple with the problem? Because they didn't have the necessary resources to compete with the American movies. It wasn't that Lenin simply rejected cinema because American movies flooded the market. What he said was, cinema is the most important art for us all. And what he gave was Vertov and Eisenstein and people like that the task to transpose the lessons of agitation and propaganda that they had learned from Plekhanov and that Lenin carried forward in What is to be Done, and to transpose them onto the field of media, trying to unite form and content in the very art of cinema itself. And that's why I believe that today, as revolutionary socialists, we have to grasp the potentiality of social media. So I don't want to even deal with slacktivism as a form of online activism, but what I want to do is really go into the everyday use that people use the internet in, that we use the internet in our trade unions, in different movements, in the campaigns that we run, ultimately has enriched some of the campaigns that we have run over the past, and also can provide a basis to understand in what ways we have to move forward in terms of theorizing the kind of problems we need to address in our practical agitation and our propaganda. Because if we look at what we do, oftentimes we set up a stall at our university, or we hold a branch meeting in our trade union, and at the same time we use an online petition. The use of online petitions, everyone has set up an online petition in the way that effectively has tried to gather people around them. The problem, though, however, has been with the online petitions, and if you look at the disunity of form and content, is that many times we haven't been able, and you aren't able to retrieve the kind of addresses that you would collect on a socialist worker stall with the kind of petitions that you get online. In one very good case, after Millbank, we had a normal petition that we were going around with through the colleges and through the university, and on the other hand we had an online petition in which Noam Chomsky signed up. I still don't have his email address, etc. And I think that really means that we need to start to think about how revolutionaries can start to grasp not only user-generated content, but also start to think about how can we come to terms with the kind of form that can drive and accelerate the kind of contradictions inside of the system as a whole. And that relates to one thing. There's and Hossam pointed that out very well and very implicitly, but it's one of the crucial points, that there's ultimately a dialectical relationship between online and offline political action. And in many ways, that kind of relationship also reflects the relationship that Hossam described between the mainstream media and social media, and that Johnny Jones lays out in his article in a few ISJs ago very well. However, we often think about producing online and having online political activities as simply about putting up an article or just putting up theory, and that happens online, and that the practice effectively happens offline in some way. But as I mentioned with the example of the petition, and that's what I think we need to come to terms with, is effectively that by setting up a petition offline, by setting up a Facebook group by setting up a Facebook group online, you're trying to cope with the problem of how do we replace structures, how do we come to terms with structures that don't exist on the ground, and effectively try to create offline and feed it into our offline revolutionary activity, and in order to help us with revolutionary activity on the ground. So, well, what should we effectively do, and how can we as Leninists, understanding that the CIA, understanding that the Labour Party, the Democratic Party and Obama, and all these various different political actors and social forces and social classes in society are changing the way that they use and the way that they conceive of the internet, what do we as Leninists have to do differently? And the thing is, the starting point for it is the student movement for me, because the student movement showed that FE students, who many of them who were in the SWP at the time, didn't have any political structures in their sixth form colleges or in their schools, and effectively set up Facebook groups and Facebook events in order to mobilize for the student walkouts. And so far, it did actually work. But how do we actually come to terms with the different social media that we have at our disposal today, and turn an audience which is mainly passive rather than interactive into producers of revolutionary politics? How do we turn them into members of the SWP? And I said that at the Gigi Ibrahim meeting yesterday evening, and I will name a few examples about it. it isn't simply enough to put up a video of myself giving a 30-minute speech on police brutality in order to highlight all the contradictions inside of the capitalist system, on why the police protects the 1%. Ultimately, the Ian Tomlinson video of 5 seconds did what I didn't succeed in doing in a 30-minute speech. And what we need to be thinking about is we cannot simply leave it to the Guardian to expose those modern-day contradictions. We cannot simply leave it to the liberals, but ultimately we need to cut right through that in order to turn an audience into active participants. And I'll take an example from theatre and from Brecht that effectively highlights how we can absorb the rich Marxist tradition in terms of coming to terms with the kind of interpassivity problem, the kind of problems of the audience, in terms of seeing where we want to go, where we want to go next, because where we want to go. I don't have much time to go into it, but we can talk about it later on. What I wanted to really go into is something around agitation and propaganda. And we have a very rich tradition, and people should go back and read Duncan Hallis, Agitation and Propaganda, Chris Harman, The Revolutionary Press, and Lenin, What is to be done, and the reason of why he speaks and why he sees the necessity for an all-Russian newspaper. And Duncan Hallis writes in Agitation and Propaganda, and this relates to a problem that the Egyptian comrades faced very much. We're talking to small numbers of people rather than on the basis of mass agitation. So what we are arguing is basically propaganda, but it's here that confusion arises. Because there is more than one sort of propaganda, there is a distinction between abstract propaganda and that propaganda which can hopefully lead to activity, concrete, realistic propaganda. So in order to come to terms with the problem, sometimes, of course, it is much more valuable to sit down with your neighbor, sit down with your fellow college or university student, and really have an intense political relationship with those people, rather than try to activate someone 100 million miles away. And the thing, but the thing is that we can start to raise concrete, realistic propaganda inside of the social networks, inside of the social networks, and in the internet, because the internet ultimately, and this is what our comrade Miriam Arouak writes about in Online Palestine, one of the books that she just has recently written, is that effectively the internet is like a city. In the same way that the city is neoliberal, the internet, of course, is dominated by the logic of capital accumulation, of capital production. But at the same time, there's also a space for resistance to capital. Whilst you have, billboards, advertising, crap that we don't want to buy, but then suddenly find ourselves buying. And at the same time, you'll have revolutionary graffitis, you'll have, the pamphleteers, you'll have the public squares, etc. That's what we need to conceive the internet of. It hasn't replaced the public squares, but they stand in a relationship to one another. In the same way that we have seen that we test things in practice, offline, in the same way that we try to agitate amongst workers where the workers and the masses are found. We also have to do that on an online basis. And the distinction there is really crucial between networks and online networks as spaces of dissent and as tools. And in the same sense that actually what really has become clear is that, and on November 30th, for example, when 2.6 million workers went out on strike, what you saw was that people uploaded pictures from their picket line, from their strikes, and started discussing underneath those pictures really what is the way forward for the strike, what is going to happen next, how are we going to intervene, etc. And what people really started to try to do is try to distill the kind of experience and try to put forward their arguments about what was happening on the day itself. The second one is using, as I outlined before, like the FE students did, Facebook, Twitter, etc., as tools. And what we understand is that Facebook, of course, cannot replace or Twitter cannot replace the newspaper as the tool, and the newspaper remains the first and foremost tool of any revolutionary organization in order to overcome the unevenness in class consciousness, in order to act as the organizer, and also to act as the kind of authority that simply cannot be established online, where you have little bits and pieces of information, and where you have a disunity of form and content that I spoke before. And I need to sum up. But there's one last point that Chris Harman mentions in the Revolutionary Press, which is important, that he speaks about a process of distillation which is still needed to separate the new ideas from the old ideas, which are still mixed in workers' consciousness. And Chris Harman ends that paragraph by saying that process of distillation is not that difficult, and that is why the most successful papers have always been those produced in upturns of the struggle. Now people are producing and are putting online photos, they're putting up their videos, they're putting up little comments and are even expected to comment. And what we effectively have to understand as revolutionaries is how we integrate that into our overall mode of generating, of agitating, of producing propaganda, and also building upon the self-activity of the working class itself. Zinoviev, not very popular, once called that the communist reporters, but even the IS in the late 1960s and 70s had the idea, in order to deeper implant ourselves inside of the working class movement, we had to have industrial correspondence. And I think that idea is a very valuable one in order to understand what we can do today. In order to build for a revolutionary party, those things are very crucial at this moment in time, in order to understand. And this is a really rough draft of and a work in progress. But I think it can lay a basis from which we can have a real discussion for the kind of needs that the Revolutionary Party needs to face today, and successfully develop a rich Marxist tradition that has come to terms with many difficult questions before.
Yeah, two things. So I'm David from Barcelona, member of Lucha and also a member of the United Against Fascism and Racism League. I think there's two slightly different things in terms of the movements and our parties or organisations, and I think it's interesting to see how they can relate. As United Against Fascism and Racism in Catalonia, we use Facebook, Twitter, and don't forget simple mailing lists on Google Groups, which are a useful instrument for organising. Just one example of the use of Facebook. The other day Spain won some football match, and in Barcelona, Spain is not flavour of the month, but they got about 1,500 people out. If it's Barca, they get 50,000, 100,000, but 1,500 people came out, maybe mainly standard football fans, but with a hardcore of Nazis, with Nazi flags, doing Nazi salutes. One of them was a councillor in a town just next to Barcelona. We had a photo of him doing a Nazi salute behind the Nazi flag and pushed it on Facebook, and the party is now being forced to discipline him. We don't know if they'll expel him, because it's a problem, he's a councillor, but being forced to discipline him because of the coverage that's been given. They knew he was a Nazi, but it's undercover. Now it's out in the open. And similar to what Hossam said about... it wasn't just the 800 people that shared that photo on Facebook, it was also that made the jump to the standard media that then said, look, we have a councillor that's making Nazi salutes, this can't be right. We use Facebook as well to get contacts. We have 6,000 something followers on our Facebook page. But then we say it's not enough to follow us on Facebook. We have meetings in the local areas. If we find that we have 5 or 6 people in the local area, so we'll get together, organise a meeting, and we start emailing them or Facebook chatting and stuff. Then that also feeds into terms of us as a group, political organisation. Because if I'm in a conversation on Facebook with someone who's interesting, I say, well, look, let's be friends on Facebook, not as the movement, but as me. And once somebody's in contact with me personally, I can say what I want. I'm no longer a representative of a broad movement. I have to limit myself. And so we get into debates about the Middle East or Islamophobia or whatever. And also, if you're in a chat with somebody on Facebook, so this is interesting, why don't you give me a phone number and we'll call? Because anybody will chat on Facebook about anything. But once they say, okay, here's my phone number, call me up, then you have a real direct personal contact. We got a member, he ended up leaving because he was on his own, but a member in the Basque country for a time. But the first contact was He may come up as a friend in Facebook, then comes up in chat, so give me a phone number, and then we're in half-hour-long telephone calls. We've had meetings in Pamplona. Thanks to that, he's still in contact. So it can be useful as long as you make that clear that you have to step from Facebook into the real world. And Facebook is not the real world.
Just briefly, on social media, I think it's just worth emphasising that there's a wall between the two things, the kind of newspaper, for example, and Facebook or Twitter. And I think we have to use these tools, but we can't overstate their importance. I think it has to, for example, in my union, National Union of Journalists, we're still struggling to get a decent website, let alone doing Web 2. And you know, it's been going for about 2 years. We still haven't got a website where someone can go to it as a journalist and actually join the union. It still can't be done. And actually, you know, ask the question, well, why is that? I think there's a reason why trade union bureaucracies are slow to use Twitter, to use apps. There's hardly any, I don't think there's any trade unions that have apps. I could be wrong, sometimes I'm wrong. Unison's got one. Okay. And they're very slow to use any of these tools, and I think it's something to do with control and the idea of something being too direct to the membership. It hasn't been mediated through the bureaucracy or through various channels that they'd like it to be mediated through. But I think we can see ways to use social media, such as I have an app called iGaza, which I'm plugging, obviously. It's free, of course. But it just shows that it's possible for little people to actually disintermediate the mainstream media, to bypass them. And the Jerusalem Post did a little shout out for the app and noted that, oh gosh, these Arabs are getting very good at social media. I'm not an Arab person, as it happens, but you know, that's how they saw it. These dumb people, how can they do social media? And we've got to catch up. And so now the IDF, the so-called Israeli Defense Forces, now have a whole department for social media. And they give out money to lots of people to go and blog and do various things in the media and pretend to be not giving out state propaganda, but just being individuals saying something about a subject. And so they see it as a big issue. And it takes it back to the Iraq War, where the New York Times talked about the biggest problem in fighting and prosecuting and winning that war was actually world public opinion. It wasn't Saddam's missiles or the lack of them, it was world public opinion. And I think it's our ability to, as the little people, if you like, against the 1%, our ability to use social media shouldn't be overlooked. So we should use it to our advantage, but at the same time, it's always much better to actually have real people to talk to. So the two things have to go together. The next meeting on the riots, I mean, it was much overstated in the media about how social media organised the riots. Is a nonsense. If anything, I think it was BlackBerry Messenger organised the riots. But actually, having fast communication just does help in a riot situation, so you can spread it very quickly from Tottenham to Hackney, which we'll be talking about next, I think.
I wanted to come to the point that Hossam finished with, which I think is about what kind of organiser do we need? What kind of person are we talking about at the centre of this project? And I think it's a really important question because he raised a really fundamental question about what we're trying to do with social media, which to me, the only interesting discussion worth having is can we use it to build a revolutionary organisation? And therefore the figure of the kind of communist correspondent I think is really important because we're not really talking about armies of citizen journalists that we want. There are armies of citizen journalists. We want armies of revolutionary socialist journalists. And we want them to be able to do what Hossam said, which is actually that they themselves, independently of being told by people on the Central Committee or from the paper or whatever, will actually come out with the right line, with the right politics, will know what to do in the right situation, will be leaders in the class without having to go on Twitter. Now, there isn't how do you get to that situation? How do you manage to produce that generation of people? Yes, you have to engage with the tools that are there. I think you absolutely have to have your own publication where you have that relationship of form and content that Mark talked about. But the purpose of this is to produce people who will say and do the right things. What was really striking about the Bolsheviks was that even when the central spine of organisation and the central paper didn't exist, that they came out with the right things. The same line was argued in the leaflet that the Bolsheviks had put into a factory in Kazan as it would be in St. Petersburg. In order to get to that, they had to have the all-Russian newspaper. They had to have that central tradition. They had to create a tradition. They had to have those human discussions, those human face-to-face debates and arguments and areas of to and fro. But that really is the goal, I think, that we're looking for, is creating a generation of people who can do that. And I think we have, in the language and in the spaces that people are having these discussions now, that includes being online, that includes all of these places we've been talking about. That's, to me, the importance of discussion. But the goal is exactly where Hossam ended the meeting, I think, ended his contribution in the meeting.
I would like to talk about the dangers of the use of social media, because I will give you a practical example. I'm from Italy, and after the 15th October 2011, there was a demonstration in Rome. There was a fight against the police in some squares. The police and government and all the political forces invite people to share information about the protesters, about the people that were in the streets, and they shared photos and videos, and many people were charged, they were arrested because of the use of social media. And many people that paint graffiti are arrested because they show on Facebook their pictures and they show themselves. So I would like to ask Hossam, how did they face the repression? Because I think many people think that internet is a free place where you can write and share everything. It's not a free place, and even if some speakers can clarify me how something about the accumulation of capital. Thank you.
I wanted to ask a very similar question really. We know that anything that goes online is ultimately digital, and anything that's digital can be analyzed using computers. And unfortunately, it's the wrong side of the struggle that has the control over the access to all that information, the ability to analyze it using a lot more than we have. So we know that everywhere from China to Iran to the US and the UK, governments are as actively using the social media as we are. And again, I'd like to know how that's being addressed by the movement in Egypt, and how comrades here think that we should address it here. Thank you.
After the speaker, there was a man in a white shirt on the side. Yeah, actually, you're next, so if you can stop me from the man.
Yeah, thank you. When I wrote the article last year in International Socialism, really it was responding to what was a big upsurge in discussion about Facebook and Twitter that had almost come out of the blue. You started to see some people talking and writing about it, but it was really the Arab revolutions that really kicked it off. So I'm really glad to see that this is a conversation and a discussion that is ongoing. And what I wanted to point to in particular, I think that the crucial thing that both myself and Hossam talk about, that relationship between the movement, social media, and the mass media, the bourgeois media, is very, very important. I think that when Hossam says that, about lazy journalists, it's not just about them being lazy, let's be clear. There's the whole issue of what Nick Davis talks about as journalism, the way in which cuts and attacks on jobs and conditions lead to these kinds of shortcuts. There's also, of course, the way in which a lot of journalists look towards people like Hossam as key indicators of very important demographics within different communities and different movements. What we can see, I think, there is that when we say that we're at the mercy of the mainstream press, this points to one thing which is clear, which is that we need to build a very strong, independent, revolutionary press. And I think that one of the inspirational things that you see actually coming out of the Arab Revolution is those videos of members of the RS selling their paper hand over fist in Tahrir Square. But of course, the revolutionary press isn't just limited to papers. It's also about what is the revolutionary press doing online, when we can use videos, when we can use social media and all of these other things. I want to talk quickly about another aspect which I think is very important. If we look at the recent workfare protest, the protest that happened around workfare, I want to argue that could they have happened without social media? Well, of course, there could have been these protests without social media. But the way that they did happen did involve a huge element of people using social media, not so much to organise them, but in order to get that talk about what's going on, the way that that then connected with The Guardian and then other newspapers picking up on what was happening, and of course also the crucial occupation of Tesco's right next to the House of Commons, and the way in which all of these things came together to create, almost a perfect storm. And as Marxists, we analyse, what's actually happened, and I think we have to come to grips with all of these things. Just quickly, the final thing that I want to say, we can talk a lot about. We talked about Slacktivism briefly. I think this is a really inadequate way to talk about things. When we talk about the internet, we've got to be clear. When people say, "Oh, Slacktivism," this is just so people can think that they're doing something. They're clicking a petition, but they're not really getting involved. People had, umpteen ways of not getting involved long before the internet came along. But everyone who's been on a protest or a political meeting recently will meet someone who their first experience of getting involved with stuff will have been the internet, will have been clicking a petition or whatnot. The crucial question for us then, and I think that this is the same with all elements, are we using the internet to control people, to be a passive disseminator of information, or are we using it to try and get people involved in activity? Are we trying to use it to enable people? You can look at things that happen online, like petitions and online petitions, and you can see how that's very much a sort of we'll do it for you. That happens in other layers of the labour movement and activism as well. We've got to be the people who are saying that no, we're not going to do it for you. You have to be involved in making it happen. And just finally, the whole thing about will the revolution be televised? The revolution will be tweeted, the revolution will be live streamed, and no one will actually be in their house to watch it on television. They'll all be out on the streets with their smartphones.
Yeah, I think this has been a really interesting discussion, and sometimes when socialists address the question of social media, I think there's a tendency to counterpose the message, if you like, to the medium. And I think the impression we're getting today is that the medium, how the message is disseminated, is so important actually to the real contours of events and politics. Now, Marx right when he said that, when he talked about how the principle that class struggle is the motor of history, that's as true in Egypt as it is anywhere else. But of course, Marxists have never had the view that history is just about class struggle. We've always had the view there's much more than that going on. And if you think about changes in technological transformation, that's so important to the real contours of events, and that's true of social media as well. So ultimately, if you want to put that in Marxist terms, and you're talking about changes in the relationship between humanity and nature, that ability to comprehend nature in new, different technological ways. Now, this has impacted on politics, and the Egyptian revolution, I think, is hugely important to that. Because if you imagine any other major historical event in the 20th century, and you think about that event, say, for example, the Night of the Long Knives in Hitler's Germany, imagine if someone in Berlin on that night had been able to tweet information around what was happening. Imagine if they had been able to immediately themselves broadcast it to a global community. Now, I think our understanding of that historical event would have changed as a result of that technological transformation. Now, and that's why I think over the last 2 decades, socialists can't dismiss the significance of these changes, because they've dramatically democratised access and dissemination of information globally. And when Johnny asks, we don't use social media to passively control people, that we're all really happy to hear that's not what the ISJ is trying to do. But I would challenge you, you couldn't actually do that if you wanted to. All you could, the most you could do is you could try and do what the Chinese administration has tried to do, which is filter it, block it out, but you can't actually, I don't think, use these technologies to control people in that way.
I think it's been really interesting, and I think the whole thing about seeing the relationship between online and the rest of people's political activity and everything else is the important thing, because you can get this, the polarisation, which you can get those that say, you know, as somebody said earlier, you know, that the internet is the answer. It's like the magic key. You know, it's the shortcut. We've been waiting for it. Now we know how to make a revolution to get everybody involved. Or on the other hand, you get people who are proud. What's this Twitter, what is it? You know, and this idea that I'm so proud that I don't touch this stuff. And I think, you know, they're both wrong places. And if we, you know, as revolutionaries, we sort of believe in change, don't we? We believe in things moving on and actually using every possible tool we can. I mean, that absolutely needs to be central for us. And I think that some of the interesting things that come out of the revolutions, and whether it is Egypt or Bahrain or other places, is actually in the repressive states, the social media played a special role for people that couldn't connect because of the repression, that couldn't physically have meetings publicly and meet in the street and sell their paper openly. It's played a special role where they were forced, if you like, to use something. And actually, the fact that you can see revolutionary socialists selling the paper in the streets of Cairo and Alexandria and everywhere else is a gain of the revolution. And actually, to see them standing there, you know, when we went back there and seeing people sign up and give their names and addresses in the street to strangers selling a revolutionary socialist paper, that's a gain of the revolution, because actually it's not that just, oh, we've chosen to use the paper now. It's like they can do this now. They can connect to real people because people aren't frightened to give their name and address to a revolutionary in the street in Cairo. And I thought that was a wonderful sight and absolutely, you know, made me cheer, sort of thing. But I think that the sense of what we want to do, you know, is not just to be an efficient disseminator of information. You know, that's not solely what we want to do. We do bus strike on, get out tomorrow. You want that out to everybody fast. But at the same time, we want the people then to go on the picket lines, to bring a socialist worker. As editor of Socialist Worker, I've got an interest in promoting this. But you know, that sense of why do we have a physical paper? It's not efficient. It has to get in trains, it has to be in trucks, it has to be taken to Scotland physically. This is not an efficient way to get information across, because it's about something else, isn't it? It's about actually having a connection between people. You're this revolutionary, I want to come for you to advise about what we do in our strike, and where are you having that meeting? And will you come to this big event in London called Marxism? And you can meet all these people. This is different than watching it alone on your it'll be great to watch Hossam and Mark if somebody can't be here, but actually how much better to be here and be able to take part in the discussion. And that the working together thing, I think, absolutely is vital. And when you talked about Al Jazeera, I thought that was so interesting, because of course during the 18 days they shut down the internet. The state can do that. We have to be able to function. And yet 1 million people marched on that Tuesday or wherever it was. And that sense of actually things didn't stop. But what was interesting about the Al Jazeera thing, everybody, you see, I thought that when I was there, lots of people were holding up signs in English and in lots of other languages because they wanted the word to get out to the world. And because they didn't have the internet, they knew it wasn't happening. And so, in fact, it wasn't the same in the year anniversary. Everything was in Arabic. But during the 18 days, and people would recognise, you know, you're a white woman, who are you? Tell the world about the revolution, you know. And actually, when Al Jazeera went up, they hung up sheets from the side of one of the buildings, all sewn together, and put Al Jazeera live onto it. And so you have people standing in Tahrir Square in their hundreds of thousands, watching themselves on telly on a sheet there. So it's slightly sort of bizarre, but it was almost a validation. People know this is happening. This word has gone out there. So that sense of it's so important that they were making the revolution, but that actually they knew other people knew about it. I think that was something. And I just thought it would be nice to say something about something low-tech. So about Kazaboom, about the idea of taking, if that's how you say it in English, the campaign to show footage of what the military did on walls around the cities. Just maybe to tell people about that, because I think that's a wonderful low-tech, but a way of actually organising people with work.
I hope people were at the meeting last night with Gigi, because she spoke brilliantly about views of media as alternative journalism, like Kazaboom. I wanted to make a point about, I mean, it's very important what Mark and both Hossam mentioned about, you know, seeing the value of social media or internet, of any form of technology, basically, in a dialectic prism. And I think that both means it's both positive and negative. So, I mean, thank you for mentioning my book. As I write with regards to Palestine, it's a blessing and a curse. And that's the reality that we, in this capitalist system, deal with on an everyday basis anyway, with everything. Why not with technology? You have to make choices based on the circumstances you're in. But I think the other importance about making this sort of historical materials analysis is that also you can't generalize. And I think we also have to be a bit cautious. I think it's very important that we're bending the stick the other way about, you know, being a bit less pedantic about it and being open to it. But also I think it's important to be aware of the fact that you can't generalize. It really depends on which context you're operating from. And last night we said that the three important conditions that we're dealing with. I mean, are you acting, dealing with the internet, with technology in the context of high oppression? Well, that makes a difference. You can't just say, use social media whenever you can, don't be sectarian about it. Well, if it means you can be arrested, then I think the circumstances are different. If you're organizing in the context of censorship, of course then alternative journalism is very important, but if there's relative freedom of speech, then it's not really important to spend 24 hours just, disseminating information. And finally, the context of neoliberalism and capitalism. You have to be aware of that. I mean, 19 of the 21 major internet companies are private-owned companies by multinationals. That means something, that says something, that's something that you need to keep in the back of your mind. The fact that Facebook is archiving all your data for commercial purposes is important. Now, as for my personal experiences with doing fieldwork and activism in Palestine and Lebanon, there's also really a shocking realization I got this year of the level of naivety of people who go to Palestine, not realizing how the conditions are so different there than what they're used to. It's very common that once you enter the country, the Israelis demand for you to open your Facebook account and your Google account. So they go through all your data and take you. And people are not aware of the fact that this is being done. So this is another example of why caution is important. And the final example is the fact that, of course, the internet is also part of soft power. Americans have done that for ages in all forms of media, of course also in internet media. And particularly in the Middle East, I found it really funny. The Americans have this digital outreach program that they go on blogs and networks to convince Egyptians and other Arabs to be more pro-American. But the the positive point to end with is that, of course, in most cases it doesn't work because people are a bit more ahead of the soft power PR campaigns of the Americans.
I think this has been a really good meeting, and I'll tell you why, because Mark used the phrase from Tony Cliff, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky and so on. We haven't made the opposite mistake, which can be made in this in the discussion about socialism and the internet a lot. When giants stand on your shoulder, you can't see very far, right? We're not and I think that's a big risk, to suffer from saying what hasn't changed all the time, rather than think about what has. And I do agree that the starting point when discussing the internet has to be what's changed. It has to be a historical materialist way of looking at things, which has to actually be looking at the changes in the base and the changes in the superstructure. But when people say that some countries invest in cyber warfare on a massive scale, that's not because they want to go to war with geeks, perverts or procrastinators. That's because they understand that the internet is crucial to the way capitalism operates, to the way modern capitalism operates. It's crucial to the way capital production takes place. Factories wouldn't work nowadays without the internet, many of them. It's crucial to what's happened to the workforce over the past decade, and it will continue to be crucial to the changes that will happen to the workforce over the next decade and more. And so I think we have to understand how the internet has transformed the way capitalism works, how the internet has transformed human beings' relations to one another and nature. And it's made huge changes. It means that now you can feel very close. You can make friendships with someone on the other side of the world. It means also that the way that we interpret information, the way we digest information, has changed. Not just that it becomes immediately available, but also if something doesn't come with an image now, why not? If something doesn't come with a video now, then lots of people won't read it, because this is how people digest information nowadays. And as socialists, we have to understand that. We have to understand how much more powerful videos can be than text and so on. And so I think then the question, once you've looked at what's changed, is to try and do what people have tried to do today, which is to look at how can we have a distinctively revolutionary take on this. Because that's what the insight of Lenin was. It wasn't he understood that newspapers were important. Lots of people understood newspapers were important. In fact, lots of other social movements had used newspapers before Lenin. What made the Bolshevik newspaper different, unique at first, I think, was the way in which it acted as a collective agitator, propagandist, and organiser. Was the way in which it the way in which it related to people in a way that didn't just say, you're going to reach your own conclusion. It didn't just support a strike. It said the idea that the worker on strike Lenin said the idea that the working on strike's ideas will evolve from just going on strike to fully socialist ideas is as mad as the idea that capitalism will just evolve into socialism. We have to try and make sure that their ideas evolve into socialist ideas. And that means thinking about, okay, so people watch videos now, so we need videos on our website. How do you do the interview on the video? What questions do you ask? How do you do it in a way that leads people towards socialist conclusions? That's the important stuff that we need to start to grapple with. And the way we'll grapple with it, I think, is by getting involved in starting to do some of that stuff. And we're starting to do some of that stuff. We need to do it more. We need to have ideas about how what we do needs to change in the future.
I just want to make one theoretical point and give a little practical example of it. I'm always interested when you hear the words like cyberspace used in these discussions, because of course they come from science fiction. They come from science fiction quite a while ago. I mean, when I was a teenager, I read William Gibson and Neuromancer and things like that. And in many ways, these books were incredibly prophetic, but they also get certain things completely wrong. In that kind of early science fiction, the virtual world, cyberspace, is conceived of as a kind of parallel world to the real world, and the process of going back and forth between them is very difficult and perilous. Case has to jack into the matrix or whatever. And of course, what all of this didn't envisage is that actually people would be wandering around with devices like these, and that's how the internet kind of tends, and it's not a difficult or complicated process at all. In fact, it's all too easy to just kind of get sucked into that. There is one scene in Neuromancer, I remember this very vividly because I was very excited by it as a small child. And, Case, the hero, is walking past a bank of phones. Now, as each phone he passes, it rings. As he passes, I think, great, in the future, phone calls will just be directed to your nearest phone. So what I'm getting at is that actually, we live in a world where the kind of information network that the internet actually is actually much more tightly bound in with our physical and social reality. Maybe the metaphors of spaces and worlds are actually misleading. And I'll end with a practical example, something that just happened the other day. I work on Socialist Worker and I work doing the website there. And I found out via Twitter that students at a college in Nottingham were going to walk out on strike in protest with their evil neoliberal manager. I phoned up a comrade in Nottingham. He'd also heard about this because one of the lecturers in the college was in the SWP, so they found out the traditional means. He said, we were going to go down to that picket line. I was saying, okay, can I give you a call when I'm there? So we did that. I interviewed one of the students. We put the story online and said, can anyone get a photo? One of the students had an iPad. The comrades got everyone chanting, took a great photo on this iPad, got sent to me, went online, turned around in the space of an hour, and emailed the link back to the students so they could see that what they'd just done had just kind of appeared on the net. And that was a real combination of old-fashioned techniques like, having a network of trade unions, worker militants, going and visiting a picket line, and new stuff like Twitter and using that social media. And it's the mobile devices that actually make that possible. And I think that kind of gives you an example of how the old traditions of Marxism and the workers' movement can dovetail with these new technologies in a very productive manner.
Just quickly, I think it was a really fruitful discussion. And by the way, Marx 2012, the hashtag actually was trending at one point throughout today. So that's a success for our online intervention. Not quite. I think it's better if more than several more thousand would be here throughout the day. What I want to get back to is very quickly is as revolutionary socialists and Marxists, we're not deterministic. In the sense that we know what, and we have experience of how big impacts even small groups of people, even small groups of workers have made over the last kind of year, or the storming of Millbank has made headlines. However, what we need to really come to terms with is in those kinds of situations, party organisation becomes much more crucial than ever before, and if you can make a very big impact with a small number of people, you just need to imagine what kind of even a bigger impact we would have with much larger group of people. And I think that's why Anne's point about how do we build revolutionary organisations and how do we use the technologies disposable to us at this moment in time in order to facilitate that building of organization is really crucial. Whether that key I outlined was the paper, and how do we use all the other methods of agitation and propaganda. And just to come on a very close conclusion is with something that Duncan Hall said in terms of mass agitation, and I think that's why ultimately everyone has had the experience of why you set up a Facebook event about, like, you know, a reading group on the German ideology I once did, and I had 50 people attending on Facebook and only 5 people turned up. In the same way, the 11th of February in Egypt is actually a case example of why sometimes agitation doesn't work out, because Duncan Hall is right in his thing on agitation and propaganda. He writes, widespread agitation with general focus is not possible without a significant number of people who suitably placed to carry it, without a party. And I'll leave it with that. Join the SWP, join the debates around the internet, and become a revolutionary.
Yeah, I'm just going to address a couple of points raised by the comrades regarding security concerns. There isn't a recipe, for this. It does differ from one context to the other, and even within the same country it differs from, one period to the other. I remember, for example, in 2007, I was traveling briefly outside the country, so we were, I met a group of comrades, including some of our veteran labor organizers. We were having like a farewell shisha, and everybody was like joking, laughing. And then a veteran textile organizer was, through this line, he was like, back in the day, if a camera came out in a strike, everybody would either like cover their faces or, run away. But now, when a camera comes out, everybody goes out with their bare chests. This was in 2007. And I asked him, why do you think this is the case? His answer was, because they've got nothing to lose. But actually, I think this is not necessarily the correct answer. If a camera had appeared in Egypt, or any strike, like few years before 2007, this would have meant that your photo would go in the crime section of any of the state-run newspapers as agitators, rioters, blah, 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 blah. Or these photos will go to state security police directly. Why? We didn't have independent press, and we didn't have alternative media. So, if a camera comes out, it makes sense, like, this will go to the authorities. Full stop. But starting from 2004, when we started to have a private media, I'm not going to call it independent media, but private newspapers who were interested in selling, so they had to put on like some interesting news that people would go and buy the newspapers' issues, from newspapers like Al-Masri Al-Yawm and the others, meant that if your photo was taken in a strike, it could appear on the front page of that private newspaper, with actually favorable coverage. And this started to change the mentality. Even in the 90s, there is like a dialectical relationship. Your face appears, okay, you get exposed to the security services. But also, you get exposed to the people, and the people are actually the biggest protection in that case. Why? Even in the 1990s, when our organization was completely underground, we still had like what we call burnt cadres, cadres who are known publicly to be revolutionary socialists because they are like involved in public activities, whether it's agitating, protests or leading student protests or organizing strikes, and they were known. But the protection that me and other burnt cadres had, even when we still got arrested, we got schooled on occasions, we got detained in the state security cells, etc., etc. But each time we got detained, there was always a reaction. Okay, like if I'm a student, I get kidnapped, because of my face got exposed and I'm known, if I get kidnapped from my university campus, there will be protests, and there will be pressure in order to release me. If strikers, like in the 80s, in the railways, even before, the independent media and everything, who led the railway strikes, okay, and they were detained and tortured by state security police, but they were all acquitted. Why? On their trial day, 30,000 people showed up and besieged the court. And if they were like convicted, they would have stormed it and torched it down. It's as simple as that. So there isn't like a recipe, whether like, should you expose your face, should you not? This is really extremely relative. And you have to know there is nothing that's like 100% safe. or else, you know, you can stay in your bed and you never leave. That's like the safest thing. Once you take out to the streets, there are risks, you know, and this is part of the risks that, that you have to take. And regarding the campaign that Judith referred to very quickly, we did hold a campaign together with other political forces, but we were central to it, called Kazibur, Liars. And we started this campaign at the beginning of this year, where basically we would go to neighborhoods, set up, you know, I mean, some screen or even use some wall of a building, and we would start disseminating, you know, showing the videos of the abuses of the army against protesters in the Occupy cabinet sit-in, the infamous one which the army massacred, and to show other, abuses to counter the propaganda that was being disseminated by the state-run media, that, oh no, I mean, there are just a bunch of thugs in Tahrir, the army didn't do anything, blah, blah, blah. And we were showing this, you know, I mean, everywhere. We were trying, and didn't cost anything. I mean, all what you need is just a small projector and a piece of cloth. You know what I mean, basically. But you needed activists on the ground who would go and bring those projectors, and they would be there to protect, you know what I mean, the projectors from any attacks by thugs, whether it's by the army or the police. And many people started change their own opinion about what's going on after those very successful campaigns that were picked up very quickly. I will sum up with one point, and sorry for taking so much time. My motto is, the spread of information is essentially an act of agitation, okay? If you go to the mahalla, you know, workers, and tell them, hello, I've just come from Kafr Dawar, and they've just had a strike over 1, 2, 3, 4, and they won. Okay, bye-bye, you know, and then you leave. I am sure after you leave, they're gonna sit down, well, it's the same company, it's just a different branch, and you know, we have the same problems. Hell, you know, if they manage to win, then we can also strike and win those demands. Why do you think the Mahalla initial strike in December 2006 triggered all of those strikes? I mean, how did those strikes, I mean, the domino effect work? I did not enter a single factory in 2007 without hearing, you know, that from the strikers. We saw the Mahalla workers, you know, I mean, winning, so we decided to move along. We heard that the Mahalla workers had won, so we decided to start our strike. We read that the Mahalla, you know, the Mahalla strike won, so we decided to do that. Just sometimes by spreading information about real industrial actions and acts of resistance on the ground, as simple as that, it can actually trigger the domino effect. I mean, when people talk about, oh, Tunisia inspired Egypt, I mean, how did it inspire us? We were watching it live on Al Jazeera. We were seeing things that they were doing that basically inspired us. We need to visualize dissent, comrades. We need to visualize dissent. I can spend hours and hours and hours explaining, you know, what the Mahalla workers are all about, or what they are doing, or I can show you a slideshow, you know what I mean, basically. That would be much more powerful. And again, I think if Lenin and John Reed were alive, they would have been one hell of bloggers.